The climate change debate often pits right and left against one another, but we sit down with a leader of the Conservative Climate Caucus who offers a better approach.
And so I think sometimes many on the right, articulate it as climate change is the hoax. But if they really think through it, I think what they're saying is the solutions being presented feel like a hoax.
On this episode, we talk with Representative John Curtis, who articulates a conservative approach to climate and energy issues that actually strengthens our free enterprise system. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and we're joined today by Congressman John Curtis. He represents Utah's 3rd Congressional District. And Congressman, thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
It's great to be with you, Nick. I love what you do, love Sutherland, and just happy to be with you today.
Thanks so much. We enjoy a good partnership, and got to say our congressional delegation in general here in Utah has always been great to work with, so thank you to you and your staff.
You bet.
So we want to talk today about climate change, which is maybe not something always that we dive into through the lens of kind of right-of-center politics, right. But you've been doing that in recent years.
I have. I've leaned into it and learning a lot myself and actually having a very good experience.
So I wanted, for our listeners, we're kind of framing this as what is the right conservative approach to climate change? And I want to ask you to kind of give us a lay of the land. What's the state of the debate, and what would be your vision for the approach?
So if I just had the elevator pitch time, and then hopefully we'll dig into it a little bit deeper, is I think what conservatives may not understand is the best policy for energy independence, the best policy for our national security, the best policy for the U.S. economy is also the best policy for the environment. And I think too often conservatives have felt like they're going to be asked to sacrifice national security, the economy, affordable, reliable fuel. And so there's no wonder they push back.
So that's something that it's been remarkable hearing you talk about this in recent years, because almost always in the climate change or environment or energy debate, those things are framed against one another to say that economy, energy, climate, it's kind of like you can't have it all, so you have to pick one. But you're saying that's not the case.
So it was a huge aha moment for me. And there's no better example of what you've just articulated than Europe. Europe went down a path and they were told they had to give up affordability. They had to give up reliability. They weren't told, but they gave up national security. They gave up energy independence because they wanted to be clean. And they made some really bad decisions. They had a decision about fracking and decided they didn't want to frack. So today they buy fracked natural gas from an adversary, Russia. Environmentalists told them they needed to shut down nuclear, clean nuclear. And so that's been replaced with Russian petroleum products. And so this is what you've just articulated is why it's so important for conservatives to engage. We don't want to go down that path or we're sacrificing our national security, our energy independence, affordable, reliable prices. And I think sometimes if we're not at the table pointing out the fallacy of some of those decisions, then we'll likely make those same mistakes.
It sounds like essentially if we were to boil it down to a principle of sort of the state of the issue today, the most fervent champions of environmental policy are very idealistic and not very pragmatic.
Well, okay.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, I'll take that. But I've met with so many on both sides of this issue, and I will tell you there are a giant host of people to my left who are genuine, who are very receptive to my ideas, who want to work with me, and just like on the right, the left also has their extremism, and so sometimes that extremism carries the day. And the voice of that extremism carries the day, and that turns off conservatives. When they're told, "Look, we're going to shut down airline travel, or we're going to take away your beef, or we're going to destroy the economy, or we hear the Earth's going to blow up in 7 years." Those types of things are not helpful for the debate, and I think too often they're the loudest voice on the left.
And it seems like kind of on both sides that this is why, and we'll get into some of the details of some of the things you've been working on and proposing, but why to me, it seems very compelling because it's acknowledging an issue, but approaching it in a pragmatic way. And as you're saying, there's actually a lot of pragmatism on both sides. And so that should be encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as Republicans, one of the mistakes we've made is we've just been critical without bringing our solutions forward. And that's what I'm offering is not just saying, hey, I think we can do it better, but here's how. And those hows actually are right in conservative comfort zones.
So I want to ask about that because it's the narrative out there, of course, that folks on the right are at least skeptical of climate change, if not outright sort of hostile toward any discussion around it. And sometimes it seems that, at least from my perception, a lot of that skepticism, shall we say, is to say, look, yes, we want to take care of our environment. Yes, we want to conserve this beautiful planet. And in our case here in Utah, one of the best places in the nation for the beauty of the outdoors. We want to conserve and protect that. But do you think some of the skepticism from folks on the right comes in when there are these proposals that do seem rather intense, to say the least, to say that, okay, well, if you want to save the environment, you got to stop driving your SUV. We have to radically change the structure of the economy. And if you don't agree with that, then you're not on the side of environmentalism. Is that sort of a false choice?
That is so, you've articulated the situation so well. And let me say it just slightly different. A lot of times you'll hear, oh, that's a hoax. I think what they really mean is that solution is a hoax. So, for instance, President Biden is doing a lot to shut down U.S. production of fossil fuels, and almost at the same time begging some of our adversaries, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, to produce more. Well, that feels like a hoax, right? The shutting down the Keystone Pipeline, and as a result, we're trucking that fuel in instead of going through a pipeline, emitting more greenhouse gas emissions. That feels like a hoax. And so I think sometimes many on the right articulate it as climate change is the hoax. But if they really think through it, I think what they're saying is the solutions being presented feel like a hoax.
So have you had success in this case talking with voters on the right to say, look, understand where the skepticism when there's these big, bold policy ideas like the Green New Deal that you've talked about before, pointing out that there's actually a better way than that. Do you think that's a winning message with voters on the right, that there's actually some policy interventions that can address this in a way that would align with values like free enterprise, supporting the energy sources we have that can actually be part of the solution?
So I will tell you a couple of examples. Back in Washington, D.C., I've worked hard to get my other Republican colleagues talking about this. Today, I have what's called the Conservative Climate Caucus. It's one of the largest caucuses in Washington, D.C. Republicans talking about climate is one of the largest caucuses in Washington, D.C. We have about 85 members. That's a third of all House Republicans have jumped in on this. And I think in many ways, the reason they have is they're tired of getting their teeth kicked in at a town hall meeting when they don't have good answers. And it's not a good answer to say, it's all hooey. A good answer is, let me tell you how I would deal with it. Let me tell you what I'm doing about it. And I think my Republican colleagues have really related well to that. Here in Utah, I actually think I've made a little bit of a tactical mistake, and let me tell you what I mean by that. I've spent most of my effort in D.C. trying to convince my Republican colleagues. All of a sudden, it dawned on me, I need to do more work back home, convincing the right here that this is a winning issue. Not only is it a winning issue, it's a conservative issue. And everybody will agree that Republicans want to be very, very good on taking care of this earth. I don't know anybody that doesn't want to leave this earth better than we found it. And so I've now started a series of meetings around my district, in my home, talking to people as far right as I can find about this issue. And I get a series of responses. Probably the worst response is, you're giving me a headache, right? Like I'm trying to wrap my mind around this. What I've thought all along, right? I need to be running from. You're telling me to run into, and so I view that as very positive. I've also found many who are like, oh, this feels so good. Thank you for articulating this in a way that helps me understand it.
Seems like one of the potential political divides on this issue, that maybe a way to put it is this, that in years past, seemed like whether you were a conservative or a liberal would inform the kinds of solutions you bring to the table on a given issue. And a little bit more so now, it seems like the kind of that right-left divide is feeling more and more like how much you talk about specific problems. So do you think that it's part of it is that conservatives, folks across the spectrum can agree we want to take care of our environment, reducing carbon emissions should be an important part of that, but are the solutions just different? And your solutions that embrace free enterprise, is that part of it?
It is. And I think that's what people, when they hear the solutions, it feels very market-based. It feels very market-driven. It feels right in line with conservative values. It fuels the economy. It not only keeps our economy strong, it puts it on steroids. And when people hear and understand that, well, I didn't really, I've been told all along, I've got to sacrifice our economy. I have to sacrifice national security. And I'm going to tell you, it does take a few minutes for them to get comfortable with that because it's just so foreign to what they've been told.
So we need to take a quick break in a minute, but when we come back, I want to get into more some of those details, kind of go through your plan or your vision that incorporates these things that almost in some ways is sort of an all of the above. There is a sort of a pluralistic approach to maintaining a strong economy, strong energy sector, and yes, bringing down emissions and taking care of our environment, which again, I think is a compelling message to tie those together rather than have those be opposed to one another. Before we go, the last quick question for this segment I want to ask you, and this is again, thinking about the folks who might be skeptical or unsure where to turn. Where do you go for good, sound information on this issue that's reasonable, that's accurate to the scientific data, but that also is not trying to be dramatic and elicit an emotional response? Where's the best place to go?
So I regret there is not a good place. It's taken me 6 years to get here. I've been on 6 continents. I've looked at geothermal in Iceland. I've looked at solar in South Africa. I've been around the country looking, touching, feeling. And one of my next biggest challenges is to help formulate that source, right, the conservatives can go to. There are, I get a book about a week in my office. One is pro-climate, one is anti-climate. There's so much information out there. It is very, very confusing. So I regret, I wish I could give your listeners just this magic response. And I'm hoping in the future to be one of those who helps bring this information together in a digestible way.
Well, for now, hopefully this episode can be part of that,
exactly.
As well as your work with the Conservative Climate Caucus.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. We've been talking with Congressman John Curtis. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas for our conversation with Congressman John Curtis about the conservative approach to climate and energy and environmental policy. We're going to jump back into the conversation, but first, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this conversation as well as previous episodes that you can use in your conversations with friends and family. You can also subscribe to this podcast on any of the major platforms wherever you like to get your shows. That's defendingideas.org. Congressman, I want to jump right back in as we're essentially giving listeners a framework, sort of what's the conservative agenda with respect to taking care of our environment in the right way. And I want to start by asking you, you've spoken a lot about the role that fossil fuels can play that's a little bit antithetical to some of the narratives that are out there that suggest we just have to eliminate them entirely. So the question I think on some folks' minds is, what is the right balance? How do we balance fossil fuels and renewables, and how does that translate into a sort of conservative environmental agenda?
So this is a huge question, and I've got it all in my head. I hope I can have it ramble out in some fashion that makes sense. But let me start with the conversation about fossil fuels. I think oftentimes there's a feeling that people just hate fossil fuels, and that the debate is really about getting rid of fossil fuels. And I think it's really important to come back and say, the problem is pollution and emissions. It's not fossil fuels. And so, I love to ask my friends on the left, do you hate fossil fuels or do you hate emissions? This is an astounding fact. The United States has reduced more greenhouse gas emissions over the last decade and a half than most of the countries trying to reduce emissions combined. We did that, hold your breath, with a fossil fuel. Natural gas. Natural gas is much cleaner than many other sources. And so instead of saying, look, fossil fuels are bad, I think it's a much better conversation to say, how do we reduce emissions? And if that's using, you mentioned the balance, okay, if that's renewables, if that's nuclear, if that's fossil fuels, how are we best able to reduce emissions and hang on to those things like national security, energy independence at low affordable price? Now, this is a really important statistic. We produce natural gas 40% cleaner in the United States than Russia. So just think for a minute, if we replaced Russian natural gas around the world with U.S. natural gas, the number of emissions that would be reduced, if you do the math, is better than the entire Green New Deal. And it would fuel our economy, if that makes sense. And it would make people dependent on us for energy. So I think if you're going to have a conversation about climate and reducing emissions, you have to be talking worldwide emissions, and you have to be agnostic to the source and say, okay, what reduces emissions? For those who are in the fossil fuel industry, I think this shocks a lot of people. They are on board as much as anybody to reduce emissions. They're spending billions and billions and billions of dollars to reduce their emissions. I think they're on track to get to a net zero emissions with fossil fuels. I was with a bunch of coal miners a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about a zero emission coal plant. I've seen with my own eyes a zero emission natural gas plant. So wait a minute, you're telling me that fossil fuels actually can play a role in this. So you hear Republicans a lot talk about all of the above. I think a better way to change that is we want all of the above based on what is best, not just throwing everything in. So what is best? We've talked about affordability. Europe is a good example. If it's not affordable, you're going to default back to things that emit a lot of emissions. If it's not reliable, we take reliability totally for granted here in the United States. But imagine being in a country where you don't know if the electricity is going to be running at the middle of the night when you have food in freezers, when you have a manufacturing plant. So reliability. What we as Republicans have not talked a lot about is clean. And what I'm advocating for is, look, our fuel sources need to be affordable, reliable, and clean. And those that we will be using most will be affordable, reliable, and clean. And everything in that mix has an Achilles heel. So let me give you an example. Renewables, unreliability. Storage right now is not perfected. That's a problem. Nuclear, cost. It's because we haven't really advanced technology for many years. Nuclear is expensive. Fossil fuels, emissions. Whoever does the best at their Achilles heel, I think will be the dominant fuel source in the future. But I do think we'll be using all of them because the needs of energy going into the future are so great. I think we're going to need all of them.
This is why I think your message that seems so grounded in a set of principles. And as you've outlined, for energy, it's three. We need it to be affordable, reliable, and clean. And it seems almost baffling to me that hasn't been sort of the standard of the discussion from the beginning. Why do you think there has been such a split almost where, people are kind of already picking their winners and losers? They say, well, solar and wind is the way to go. And other people say, no, it's only nuclear or whatever these other ideas that folks throw out. Why has there not before been sort of an alignment around these three principles?
Yeah, I can't tell you exactly, but I can tell you that the climate discussion is so emotional. I think a lot of the solutions that have been put forward are feel-good solutions. And people like to check that box. And I think that's here again why a lot of conservatives push back. They can see, wait a minute, that doesn't work. We haven't talked about EVs, but we could go into a long conversation about EVs and the feel-good nature of EVs. And so I think that's what I'm trying to bring that conservatives also connect with is a dose of practicality of, wait a minute, we have to ask questions. Nobody's asking questions. And I think we need to ask more questions. And for me, it after all these years of studying this, it comes down to this remarkably simple, affordable, reliable, and clean. I think some people have only been talking about clean. And if I'm honest, I think Republicans have only been talking about affordability and reliability, not realizing that we can put clean in there and still meet all of our objectives.
I think it's refreshing to hear sort of this idea of both sides have their blind spots, but both sides also have some redeeming qualities when it comes to this debate, which when we talk about, we'll talk a little bit later because I want to ask you about polarization on this issue and more broadly, and if this is maybe a model for other issues. But it seems like that first step of recognizing, okay, everybody around the table, you're wrong on some things and you're right on some things. Let's all focus on what we're all right about. And then that becomes our sort of consensus agenda, right?
I'll often start a discussion about this with, listen, I'm going to offend all my friends on the right, and I'm going to offend all my friends on the left before this is over. And if I haven't done that, I'm probably not doing a good job.
So I want to ask, you've talked a lot about this idea of trade-offs, and you talk about with natural gas and the rates of emissions with different kinds of natural gas. At our Sutherland Congressional Series, which just concluded recently, we do it every August with all members of the delegation, including yourself, and we're always happy to have you there, of course. And one of the themes that came out in a couple of the conversations, especially the panel discussions, was this idea of trade-offs. And there's that famous Thomas Sowell quote, "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." And I want to ask how you apply that to this, and if that's sort of a mindset shift on this issue, or would you say, well, yes, there are trade-offs, but as long as you arrange the trade-offs in the right way, you actually can have solutions, because essentially whatever the better trade-off is, that becomes your solution with respect to cleaner natural gas for the United States compared to other countries or other issues. How would you frame this in the context of there's a better trade-off that we could get to?
You know, I think I'm more to what you spoke to in the latter part of that statement, in that this kind of takes care of itself. I really believe the market is going to demand affordable energy, reliable energy, and clean energy. And for those who are not as into clean, I've got bad news. The world has moved on. They want to buy clean energy. We have to make a decision about whether or not they'll buy it from us. And I want them to buy it from us. And so I think, I'm just convinced in 2050, we'll be using those three standards to decide what fuel we're using. And those who do the best at those three categories will be the dominant players.
Seems like if you were to just sit down in home with your average voter, and this, I'll kind of go on a limb with my perception that I would assume that if you talk to folks and say, hey, as long as when you flip the light switch on, the power comes on. And when you pay your power bill, it's affordable. And by the way, what's generating that power is clean and good for the environment. As long as those three things are a yes, I imagine your average consumer would say, I don't care where it comes from.
Yeah, I'm all in.
If it checks those boxes, we're good.
Yeah, and I tell you, having been the mayor of Provo and having a utility, most of the residents would take affordability as their top one. And I think Europe has really done their residents a disservice. It costs 4, 5, 6 times as much to heat or cool a home in Europe as it does the United States. And I think we have to be careful, because many consumers will still pick affordability over those other two, primarily because they don't realize what it's like not to have reliability, and they don't fully understand that clean doesn't have to be expensive.
The last thing I want to ask you about before we take another quick break is one of the discussion points that's often brought up in this issue is sort of weighing mitigation and prevention versus adaptation. And so an easy example, we've had some heat waves in different parts of the country recently. There was a lot of news out of New York of school kids in schools that didn't have air conditioners that were experiencing a lot of heat. And setting aside some of the controversial political discussions around, whether specific weather events are attributed to climate change, most experts, to my understanding, say, well, you can't look at it that way. You have to look at broad trends. So setting all that aside for a moment, to, again, sort of the listener at home who's maybe not deep into this, if they're thinking, okay, if we go through a lot of work to reduce our emissions as a planet and hope to bring down our carbon output in such a way that we can slow the warming of the globe, wouldn't it just be easier to buy people air conditioners? That's a glib question. I acknowledge that. It's oversimplifying, but I use that to demonstrate What is the right balance between, yes, we can reduce our emissions to mitigate and prevent as much as we can, but also what is the role of adaptation?
Adaptation is huge. And I don't care if you're right or on the left of this issue. If you are not convinced that man's influencing the climate, you've got to admit the climate's changing, right? Nobody's really denying that the climate's changing. We can have a debate about how. And if you're on the left and you follow the science is clear. If we stopped emitting 100% of emissions today worldwide, we are on a trajectory of warming. Sea levels are going to rise. The climate is going to change, even if we stopped 100% of the emissions. So it is very foolish not to be talking about mitigation, not to be preparing. Why are we continuing to let people rebuild their homes on the sea in a place where we know it's going to be underwater? Why are we letting people build next to forests where we know they're going to burn? And I just personally think that we're missing this issue. And I've got a couple of reasons I suspect we're missing it, but we need to be talking about it. We need to be taking it seriously.
Well, when we come back, I want to get into some of the polarization around this that I would hypothesize. I want to test that hypothesis with you of whether or not a big reason why it seems like we have such a hard time really discussing this issue pragmatically is because of some of that polarization. So we'll ask that when we come back. Good. We'll be right back with Congressman John Curtis. You're listening to Defending Ideas.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn, and our guest this week has been Congressman John Curtis. We're talking about climate change, but what is the conservative approach to addressing the issue? Before we continue the conversation, I want to mention if you like what you're hearing today, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this conversation that you can share on social media. You can also subscribe to the podcast on any of the major platforms. That's defendingideas.org. Congressman, to round out the conversation, I want to elevate some of the themes we're talking about here a little bit and ask you about the issue of political polarization. It's really become just an ongoing theme in a lot of the work that we do, a lot of the things we talk about, because it seems like polarization is the enemy of sound policy. You're trying to get us to sound policy on the issue of climate. So I'd love your input on what is the role of political polarization in making it harder to really get to that principled, pragmatic approach to issues like climate and their environment or any other issues?
It's huge. And I think everybody who's looked or given this even a second thought sees the polarization in climate change and the stereotype that Republicans think it's a hoax and Democrats are knee deep in crazy ideas. And the reality of it is neither of those stereotypes are true, but that's what's portrayed and then magnified by a social media world and a cable network world. And I'll be the first to admit it's there, and that's what I'm trying to plow through. And that's probably my hardest part of plowing through this is these polarization stereotypes. And but I do find when you peel it back that there are a lot of thoughtful people on both sides of this issue.
So with that, I want to mention sort of in the context of that, yes, there's polarization, but there's also progress. And with the work that you've done with the Conservative Climate Caucus, and I want to kind of anchor it in this way. So I mentioned earlier, last year in the 2022 Sutherland Congressional Series, you spoke about this issue. This was kind of your topic, and you gave so much of what you're doing now, but also sort of this foundation of a vision and an approach for how to do this. From August 2022 to August, now September 2023, what would you point to remind folks we're making progress on this issue?
I think, and if you allow me to go back just a little further
Please.
in time, one of the most substantial pieces of legislation ever on climate was the Energy Act of 2020, a bipartisan bill that got no press. And it reduced hydrofluorocarbons by about 85%, a substantial accomplishment for lower emissions, and nobody talked about it. And Republicans didn't brag that they'd been part of it, and Democrats didn't talk about it because Republicans had been part of it. And I just find it astonishing that we made such a bipartisan effort, and nobody it went 100% unnoticed. I will say, since that time when I spoke at Sutherland, it doesn't seem like too long ago, but now that you mention it, it was actually a long time ago. I think the remarkable difference can be seen in a committee hearing in Washington, D.C. A couple of years ago, if climate change came up, the Republicans in the hearing spent the time debating the science. The Democrats spent the time defending the science. If it comes up today in my committee, Energy and Commerce, it is now a debate about methods and not about science. As a matter of fact, Republicans are usually pretty quick to say, we're not questioning science here, but we are questioning the method. And that is a very productive change. And I think it's what the country needs. And we should not be afraid of the debate of ideas about solutions.
Is there a way that you could apply, I'm imagining kind of a framework from the way you're approaching this issue. And again, as those kind of principles that you've outlined, and in this case with energy, obviously it's affordability, it's being clean, it's being reliable, but sort of the broader set of principles seems like the way you're approaching this issue is, let's not demonize free enterprise. Let's leverage it. Let's bring in the free enterprise system. Let's bring in American ingenuity, and let's look at things that can move the issue forward in a way that aligns with sort of those embedded values of what Americans are looking for in a free market enterprise system. It's pragmatic. It's solutions oriented. Is there something we could learn from that we could apply to other issues?
Absolutely. And you said that so well, I'm not even going to try to repeat it, but I will go up the tree a little bit. And it starts with this, the why. And I think this is where I start with people on the right, and that is, do you not feel a responsibility to leave this earth better than you found it? And I have never found anybody who, of course, doesn't say, oh, absolutely. Is less pollution better than more pollution? Absolutely. And so I first of all start with the why. But to your point, that melts down these divisive walls. And I wish we could never ask the question again, is climate changing and is man influencing it? Because it just brings out the defensiveness and in the Republicans. And a much better question is, okay, do we want to leave this earth better than we found it? How do we do that?
So with our few minutes left, I want to get into a little bit how we can have these kinds of conversations with others who may disagree in a way, and you've modeled well here and in other venues, sort of the disagree better approach is something our Utah Governor Spencer Cox has recently been promoting through his role with the NGA, the National Governors Association. And so let's essentially kind of train our listeners real quick. Let's give them a crash course. And if they're talking to somebody on this issue who maybe is a little bit more in the camp of, we have to just get rid of fossil fuels, that's the only way, you got to stop driving your truck, we got to change our economy. If they're talking to somebody who maybe approaches it from that angle, what have you seen as the best messages or talking points that they can use to sort of win them over a little bit, or at least identify some common ground and be able to move forward together?
Great question. I like to get them to ask themselves what we're trying to accomplish. And what we're trying to accomplish that they will agree with is a reduction of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And then we say, well, how do we best do that? And I love to then ask the questions we've talked about earlier. If I could do that with fossil fuels, would you go with me on that? And so starting with that, let's change what you may perceive as the goal. You might be perceiving the goal is to electrify everything. Well, what if that doesn't reduce emissions, right? So let's change that and define the end goal. The end goal is not just United States emissions, but worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And that totally changes the conversation about how we do that.
So as we round out the conversation, what this feels like to me is a hefty dose of optimism. There are so many issues today, and climate change being one of them, where you get in a conversation with somebody about it, and people get their defenses up, they get frustrated about it, and sometimes I think it's kind of just this we're just going to have to fight and beat the other side in order for us to be able to make progress. So I want to leave our listeners with that kind of dose of optimism and hopefulness. What about this issue have you seen either among your colleagues in the Conservative Climate Caucus or other of your colleagues in Washington, D.C., or from voters here in Utah, or essentially anywhere in the country? What are some things that you can point to that ought to give our listeners a sense of optimism and hope that, yes, we can make progress on this issue, and yes, we can do it in a way that embraces our wonderful free enterprise system?
I think the best answer I can give you is just pointing out quickly how close we are aligned on the issues. Republicans don't hate renewables. We want to use renewables. Both Republicans and Democrats like nuclear. We like emerging technologies like hydrogen and fusion. And I even had a conversation with John Kerry about fossil fuels, and where he told me, you're right. And so I would just simply say, like many issues, we're far closer than it may seem. And we need to be focused on those areas where we agree, and we'll realize really we're just not that far apart on these issues.
Well, that is certainly an encouraging way to round out our conversation, that it seems like the divisions we feel, the divisions we see on social media and in the press, don't represent how close we actually are and how close we are to making some real progress on these issues.
Well said.
Well, Congressman, we want to thank you so much for joining us on Defending Ideas and talking about some of these principles that we hope will be of benefit to our listeners. And thanks, of course, for your ongoing work and your wonderful relationship with Sutherland. We appreciate it.
It's great to be here. Let's do it again.
Excellent. We're going to take one final break before we leave you with some talking points. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, we want to share a few quick talking points to help you in your conversations on this issue. If you find yourself talking to somebody about a contentious issue, whether it's climate change, energy, and the environment, or really any issue for that matter, here are some things you can consider sharing to frame your approach to the conversation to be more productive with the person that you might initially disagree with. Number one, identify a shared goal. What is the global aspirational thing that you and the person you're talking to really want to accomplish? Number two, identify what some guiding principles ought to be as you consider ways to approach that goal. In the case of the issue we talked about with Congressman Curtis, those guiding principles with respect to climate and energy would be making sure that our power sources are affordable, reliable, and clean. But those guiding principles you could apply to any issue, the framework of those guiding principles. And then number three, any potential solution that comes on the table, weigh it against those guiding principles. Is it within those principles? And then weigh it against the overall goal. Does it help to move the needle on the goal? This will create better conversations that can encompass a wider range of potential solutions for whatever issue you're talking about. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. If you like this show, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find short clips from this episode and others that you can share on social media. You can also subscribe to the podcast on any of the major platforms. Also, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. I want to thank you for being with us this week. We'll see you next time on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nick Dunn. Thanks very much.